That's really what we mean, I think, by cancel culture is hair-trigger mass denunciation, especially when it manifests in attempts to do things like get people fired, right? I think a lot of it's driven by tech platform algorithms that reward engagement, right? The whole architecture of like likes and retweets and all that stuff really incentivizes denouncing first and asking questions later, right? Because you get that like immediate feedback loop of validation for sort of righteously throwing the first stone, right? And it's obviously incredibly anti-solidaristic, and it's certainly to the extent that movements for social justice are associated with it. This sounds like a very, very fun club to join if everybody's engaged in like mutual surveillance. It just ends up taking a lot of anger about society around you and turning it on targets that really don't have any power, right? I mean, if you can't get at the king, you might as well see if you can kill one of the other peasants.
Yeah, it's witch hunting. It's modern witch hunting. That's what it is. People feel like they have power when they're doing it. It's like they're in the Cultural Revolution, purging the bad people.
Totally, yeah.
To what extent is cancel culture driven by game theory and capitalist dynamics? Because I do see a dynamic where certain leftist influencers, leftist figures, pundits, whatever, participate in cancel culture because it's a way of eliminating competition. Most people I talk to who aren't online don't care in partaking in any of this.
Sure.
I think we both have known some people who have been canceled. You've known quite a few people who have been quote unquote canceled by the left. And I noticed the people who lead the cancellations are people who are in the exact same niche and have overlapping audiences sometimes even. So like I'm starting to see it even more cynically, that it's actually the kind of like unconscious attempt to swallow up more social capital and market share.
Yeah.
Because like there's a certain rivalry that happens. Like the YouTube algorithms, it puts people in competition with each other, whether we want that or not. It does do that. And there's a sort of incentive to be like, I'm going to like disparage my rival or whatever. Like they said this take, and I'm the pure one. And I don't know, look, I want to say, what do you think about Bluesky? Because I've had people who've been asking me like, when are you going to get Bluesky? I'm not going to get on a platform owned by Elon Musk. I don't know, I've heard bad things like people who are on Bluesky already. Like I heard that like all of the most cancel culture lefties are there and they're already like canceling each other. Like they're already fighting.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of seems like the demographic of who would go over there is probably going to be tilted in that direction. I mean, people who think, like, certainly at least out of leftists who switch over to Bluesky, it seems like there's going to be a pretty high correlation between being on the scoldier end of the left and being the kind of person who thinks that it's like an important political gesture. Those two are kind of going to go together. I don't know, man. I'm old enough to remember Google Plus, right? That was like a really big deal for a day. And like, oh, this is going to be the next new thing. And I think there's a collective action problem with like, once everybody's already on a certain platform, with getting people to, even if it's functionally equivalent, it's the Jerry Maguire thing, right? I'm leaving, who's with me, right? That nobody comes with you.
Like it does. Why would I want to get on Bluesky? It's like I'm going to be preaching to the choir. Like, is this going to be a bunch of leftists? Like, what is the point of that? I can just post on my Discord if I want to do that. I remember when they announced Rumble and all these people were going from YouTube to Rumble. I'm like, good. Put the right in the echo chamber. If I wanted to contain the right, that's exactly what I would want.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Ben Burgis, author of various books such as Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, and Canceling Comedians While the World Burns. He's also a writer for Jacobin Magazine. Recently just published an article on the US election called The Election We Could Have Had. He also has a show on YouTube called Give Them an Argument. Ben has been a voice on the left who I've wanted to have on the show for quite a while. We've talked to a lot of the same people. I know I like the way you think. Let's just say that. I think you're one of the more sane voices on the commentary side of the left, and you give an academic touch to that because you come from an academic background. You still teach, I believe, right?
Yeah.
So I think you're able to bring that perspective without coming across as a fuddy-duddy, airhead intellectual like leftists are often stereotyped for being. And naturally, if you are a sane voice on the left, you tend to attract a lot of negative people on Twitter. People really seem to have a beef with you on Twitter. I don't know what it is. But today we're going to talk about the U.S. election, but more particularly what it means for the left, because you've been one of these voices who's kind of given this criticism of the left from the left. And you have a lot of things to say, and I'm curious to pick your brain. But before we get into it, would you like to add anything there to introduce yourself that I missed?
No, that all seems good to me. So got a Substack that people could check out. It's just benburgis.substack.com, which is for the less timely and more philosophy-ish stuff.
Yeah, so I could not imagine being a streamer having to talk about politics all the time, because I've done 2 episodes so far related to it, and I already feel like I'm almost over it. I hate talking about contemporary politics, but this one I think yields so many lessons for the left, and that's what I do want to talk about. So you just wrote an article called The Election We Could Have Had. What were some of the points you wanted to get across? And I guess maybe this will be a bridging point into your thoughts on the U.S. election in general.
Sure, yeah. I mean, my basic point in that article is a very simple one, which is just that people draw all kinds of sweeping conclusions from this that are probably way too hasty. I mean, just for a sense of perspective on this, Kamala Harris did get a bigger percentage of the vote than Trump got in 2020. So I think that it absolutely could have gone the other way. And it's just that the Democrats fumbled it really, really, really badly. Right. I mean, obviously I don't need to tell anybody this, but Donald Trump this time around won the popular vote for the first time that any Republican has won the popular vote since 2004. And he won the popular vote without running as an incumbent for the first time any Republican has done that since 1988. And it didn't have to be that way. I think if you look at the series of decisions that she made, like kind of from the moment that she started running, it was always veered away from any kind of economic populist messaging and towards this, look how reasonable we are, look how sensible Republicans like us, like that. That was the very consistent message throughout, right? So as hard as this is to remember, in 2019, Harris was a Senate co-sponsor of Medicare for All. She could have dusted that off and said, I still believe that, right? That she'd never gone on record as taking that, backing away from that position until she started running for president. When she did exactly that, she had been a signatory of the Green New Deal resolution. All of this, I don't think she really ever believed this stuff, but I mean, this was all in 2019 when she was trying to position herself to run for president the first time and
primary, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So she wanted to appeal.
I think did the worst. Didn't she do the worst? I think she was one of the first to drop.
I mean, she dropped out before anybody had voted because it was obvious that she was crashing and burning, which should have been a sign for that she wasn't very good at this. But at that time, she was trying to position herself for Democratic primary when Bernie had won 22 states the last time around. Everybody kind of was trying to capture some of that energy. And so she was taking all these positions, and like the Green New Deal thing, like included a federal jobs guarantee, right? So she could have been running on these positions that she wouldn't have even been like, oh, look at me, I'm taking them for the first time. We would have made them implausible. She could have said, look, I've always supported the government giving people jobs in healthcare. But she did the opposite, right? She explicitly disavowed those positions at the beginning of her run. She picked Tim Walz, which seemed like a sop to people who wanted more of that message, but then she kind of stuck him in a basement for 3 months, and it was just completely pointless, right? He might as well have not been on the ticket. She campaigned with Liz Cheney so much that you would have thought that like Liz Cheney maybe was her running mate. She said in her debate with Trump, which, I mean, whatever, rhetorically she did well in that debate, but I mean, she said in that debate that to show that her economic plan was more serious than Trump, she said, oh, it had been like approved as like financially sound or whatever by Goldman Sachs. Right. So that's not exactly a rousing populist message. And certainly I think campaigning with Liz Cheney all the time, reveling in the endorsement of Dick Cheney, bringing it up like every day for a while. These were all things that massively reinforced Trump's narrative that he's the anti-establishment candidate, that all the whole establishment's united against him, that he's the anti-war candidate. Sounds a lot more plausible when the other person is talking constantly about how Dick Cheney loves them. And so, yeah, I think that all went exactly as well as you would think it did. And I would just say that a lot of people will say, oh, see, but what about all these pro-worker things that Biden did while he was in office? And I think Biden's domestic policy, right? I mean, ignore the genocide, but so Biden's domestic policy was a mixed bag. And he did do some good things with the National Labor Relations Board, et cetera. But I would just say two things about that. One is I think there's a difference between being like 20% better than Barack Obama and being remotely adequate to the historical moment you find yourself in. And then the other thing is like, look, even if the policy was there, which it's not, like there's a world of difference between like, oh, you have some good policy commitments and you're running an effective populist campaign, which would mean that you have like a message that identifies villains to mobilize people against, that like relentlessly emphasizes the thing that you're going to do for people, right? Like, and none of that was there. Instead, it was all reasonable Republicans love us because we're sensible people who are going to preserve institutions, which is just exactly the wrong thing to say.
Yeah, as you mentioned at the beginning, it's really not so much that Trump won. It's like Kamala lost. She lost, what was it, 15 million votes. Trump also lost 3 million votes than he had last time. So it's like Trump's actually going down too. It's just that Democrats are going down so bad that it looks like the Republicans are doing incredible right now. And they went up with the working class, though. That is worth pointing out.
Totally.
And people talk a lot about the podcast influence on that, right? Because Trump went on so many different podcasts. Kamala Harris, I believe, went on one major podcast. It was called Call Her Daddy. And it wasn't even like a long form podcast. It looked like a scripted 20-minute spiel. It was terrible. And when I looked at the channel Call Her Daddy, that's what it's called. And I was trying to like see like what demographic watches that. It seems like the type of person who is very into celebrity type gossip and stuff. And her interview got less views than all of the other videos, whereas Trump, I think, set a record for Joe Rogan. It got like 44 million. And that just suggests that like even the demographic she was aiming for did not care. And there's a lot of liberals today who are kind of trying to do this whole elitist thing again, where they're saying, oh, the Trump voters are just all stupid. They're all racist, etc., dumb. And I don't know, I look at like the audience Kamala was trying to cater to with the Call Her Daddy, and I don't really think there's necessarily like the audience of that show is necessarily smarter than the audience of Joe Rogan's show. Now, you have a unique experience in understanding this mentality because you went on Joe Rogan. And I when I saw that happen, that was like what, a year ago? I was super happy.
Yeah, it was 2 years ago. Yeah. No,
what was that like?
That was very strange. I mean, I've been watching this guy on TV since the late 90s, right? Like, I mean, I'm old enough that I remember watching him on News Radio, which is a largely forgotten sitcom from the late 90s, where he played a handyman named Joe who was really into conspiracy theories. But yeah, that was deeply strange. But for that reason, I remember that when I got the invite, I was like, my ex-wife was sitting on the couch watching TV, and I was checking my email. I brought the computer over to show her, and she said I looked so shocked. She was going to ask who died. But yeah, it was a weird thing, but it was a good, like, I thought the conversation itself was good. I mean, like, people complain, like, I think people have this very strange idea that you're going, like, if somebody like Joe Rogan has bad takes or has bad positions on this, that, or the other thing, that you're going to, like, punish him by denying him your presence on his show. And I got to say that never really made sense to me. It seems like you subtract the three leftists who've been on his show in the last 2-3 years, and Rogan would be okay. Like I don't think his audience would be abandoning him. And it's like, you have millions of people no longer watch Joe Rogan on Spotify because he hasn't had Kyle Kalinske on in too long. That seems sort of unlikely. But, you know, I mean, I guess I tried to approach that in kind of roughly the spirit in which I would approach talking to, like, somebody that I, like, if I was at, like, a sports bar and I got into a conversation with somebody about politics, it's like kind of roughly the spirit in which I would approach that, right? Like, not trying to show them that they're wrong about everything, but, you know, sort of trying to, you know, play up the stuff that I thought they were most likely to be receptive to, and you know, and like, not when I did disagree with something, like, I've got different yeah, I guess I see that a little differently, I would think, blah, 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 right? And like, I would just point out, right, like, with regard to whether Kamala Harris should have done it, that there was, like, I think somebody like Joe Rogan, in some ways, I mean, I think he's just the most famous swing voter in the country, right? But I mean, that's exactly what he is. I mean, he supported Trump in 2024, but in 2020, he supported Bernie Sanders. And I think that as frustrating as that might be to people who think about politics all the time and talk about politics all the time, which is to say, people who are like weird nerds, because that's the only people who do that, right? I mean, normal people have political impulses, they have political reactions to things that happen, but, you know, they don't actually spend all their time thinking about this stuff. I mean, that's like an extremely unusual thing to do. So I think that
they go by common sense, as Gramsci called it, right?
Yeah,
mix
totally.
of what they've grown up in and a mix of the dominant wisdom, kind of all scattered together in a kind of incoherent way. It's like a mixture of, it's a lot of instincts, right? Based on stuff that's not so coherent. So when people try to pigeonhole and say, like, oh, they're right wing on this, or right wing or left wing in this way, it's like, people don't really think right and left, I notice.
No, I don't think most people do. I think that, and I think even people who do, oftentimes what they mean by that is not necessarily what we would mean by it, right? I mean, in fact, in some ways, what's maybe even more striking to me than the actual on-air conversation with Joe Rogan is, I remember a few weeks after that happened. So, like, the conversation was in February, and the episode, I remember it was like the night before the Ukraine war started, actually, but it was when they released it. And then a few weeks later, it was on St. Patrick's Day. I was still living in suburban Atlanta, and I was bar hopping with a friend. And we ended up, the last place that we ended up at the end of the night was like a circular bar. And there's this guy who was sitting across, like, on the other side of it, like, leans over, was like, "Hey, are you on Joe Rogan?" And I say yes. And he, like, comes over and buys us a drink and starts talking. And one of the first things he says, that he's a conservative, and what he means by that, like, becomes like a fascinating question by the end of this conversation. He's a conservative, and he knows I work for a liberal magazine. He means Jacobin, so I don't love that description, but I'll let it pass. But I seem like somebody he could talk with, and we do exactly that for like 20 minutes. And it's just very funny to me because like in the first 10 minutes of talking to that guy, he'd signed on to like a platform that like the left of what most elected Democrats think, right? It was like, yeah, sure, Medicare for all, that sounds good, right? Absolutely, right. It should be easier to organize a union. It should blah, 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 right? Like he had some like wacky ideas about how like taxes should work, about like the only really right-wing thing he said, the whole conversation was that he said something that was like vaguely anti-abortion. And this is before the Dobbs decision came out. It was like still much more theoretical then. And I like pressed him about it a little bit. I was like, okay, you don't like abortion, but like, what do you actually want to do about it? Like, do you think people should be in jail for having abortions? He's like, oh no, I guess not. And then like we talked about it for a few minutes and he agreed that like a better way of like minimizing the number of abortions would be to give financial assistance to like new parents. Right. And so it's like, all right, if that's a conservative, right? Like I mean, these labels mean something to people on a kind of like vague tribal identification level, right? That like, I don't know. I think some people are conservatives because they find libs annoying, and who can blame them? But I think that most people who don't spend all of their time thinking about politics and tweeting about politics and reading about politics, they don't, like they've got these impulses, they've got these reactions, they haven't really gelled together into an internally consistent worldview, which sometimes is frustrating, but it's also kind of, I mean, given that the bottom line reality is that if you're like a serious leftist, you're a socialist, clearly the majority of the public doesn't agree with us, right? I mean, that's that is a sort of sad baseline fact, right? That most people are not like
You
there
put it
yet.
in those terms.
Yeah. But given that most people aren't like, oh, I don't have workers control the means of production yet, right? Like they're like that. Most people aren't like where we would like them to be ideologically. I would actually I'll kind of take the incoherent mixture over people just like consistently having some well worked out worldview that disagreed with us, because at least the incoherent mixture has stuff you can work with.
I noticed this whole right-left reality is something that I find very hard to get across to lefties, because you immediately, if you try to use rhetoric that is neither left nor right, even if you are in substance actually just left,
Right.
they see that as like some kind of inherently fascist thing. They see like neither left nor right, that's fascist. But like if you look at a lot of left-wing leaders who have come to power historically, they often don't come to power as explicit leftists. Like in the case of Castro, for example,
Right.
he comes to power as a sort of nationalist, like, or people come to power on single issues in opposition to something. And even the ones who have come to power as leftists usually position themselves as much less radical left than they actually are. Like Lenin, of course, he says, those other guys, they're the ultra left. I am not ultra left. And you tend to see that because like people are skeptical of like super radical change, even in a certain sense, understandably, right? Because what if they fuck everything up? So
Yeah, right.
this
I mean,
kind of
look,
like right, neither left nor
Yeah.
right reality though is reflected by an interesting thing that I saw, that AOC, people who voted for AOC in her own district as voted for as congresswoman, a lot of people who voted for her voted for Trump.
right.
And she was baffled by this. And it's like, that just shows like a lot of people aren't thinking in this like left-right spectrum.
I also think that probably says something about AOC, that she was baffled by it, right? Like I think that, like, I would imagine that like Bernie Sanders, for example, probably wouldn't be terribly confused by the existence of people in Vermont who voted for both him and Trump. Right. Like, I think that's, I don't know, maybe a learning experience for her, but like, yeah, no, I mean, I think again, people have, I mean, of course, people just like somebody as their congressperson and they vote based on that, but also, yeah, I mean, that makes, perfect sense to me, right? That there's like, that there would be a fair number of people who like the basic Trump pitch works for, right? Which is like people forget, or I don't know, like a lot of people, I think in their heads, the election is about whatever they were maybe seeing all day on Twitter, or if they're like sort of super political nerds. And it's like, I don't know, like a lot of people, what the election was about is Trump was like, okay, there's been a lot of inflation. I don't like that. There's like whatever Biden has been doing hasn't been working. And Harris is obviously closely associated with that. Trump got a lot of mileage out of saying he didn't start any new wars, that he wasn't going to. He had generally anti-establishment vibes. And I could see somebody being like, yeah, like saying she cares about ordinary people. She wants everyday healthcare, whatever. And then I like Trump for all of those reasons. And again, it's just kind of, well, look, I mean, connecting the two topics we're just talking about, like there was reporting at the time or shortly after the 2020 election that AOC had kind of cooled on involvement in the Bernie campaign in 2020, in part because he went on Joe Rogan and she didn't like that. Right. And I think that the fact that she didn't like that seems very linked to me to the fact that she would be surprised by the existence of Trump voters who voted for her down ballot, because you're not, you're thinking of the population as way more divided into like well-established ideological quadrants than it really is. Right. I mean, and that doesn't mean like, look, I would never say I was neither left nor right because I'm an ideologue, right? Like I have, like, I'm a strange nerd. So I've thought about it enough that I've got like a internally coherent worldview. But yeah, most people that you're trying to reach aren't. And it's really tricky. Like, it's really hard to say how you could ever win that kind of battle of persuasion if you like start by seeing the population as divided between people who are bad because they disagree with you and people who, who have all the right views, right? Which is why I think we've been seeing like a tremendous number of libs since the election have been reacted to it by basically doing that Bertolt Brecht line from the poem, that wouldn't it be simpler for the government to dissolve the people and elect another?
Yeah, I saw people complaining that they kept pointing out saying, see, all the people in educated districts voted Democrat. The people in uneducated areas didn't. This is the problem. And it's like, so what is your solution? Is it like, are you trying to basically go John Stuart Mill mode and basically have only the educated people vote, or have the philosopher kings rule? It's like, all right, you're just gonna say it then. Let's see how that works out.
Well, it's also funny because like a lot of those, yeah, I saw like anybody who's watching this who doesn't know who this is, congratulations. You've made much better life choices than I have. But Vosh, the streamer, there was this clip of him where he said, I'm sure that lower income people are more likely to be Republican because the working class is stupid and uneducated. And apart from the fact that the really weird thing for somebody who sometimes calls himself a socialist, and it's since the entire point would be empowering the working class, it's also just really funny because you think, well, hold on though, like go back a couple election cycles and a lot of these figures were the other way around, right? I mean, that like even in 2016, Hillary Clinton was still winning the like under $50,000 a year vote. And I mean, in fact, it's a historical reversal that Trump slightly won them, right? And I think it speaks to a long-term trend of class de-alignment, right? That working class voters are less and less reliably supporting parties they traditionally supported, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But like, if you're gonna say, oh, see, the dumb, uneducated masses don't know what's good for them, like, okay, but like they did 12 years ago. It's confusing.
And it's also, I think, not true. Like, it's already bad politics tactically, but I also think it's just not true. Like, I really don't think people who are enthusiastic about Kamala, people who are maybe strategically voting for Democrats because they think Trump's worse, that's another story, right? But
Sure.
people who are enthusiastic about like Kamala Harris and the Democrats, I think are like also low information voters. This
Totally.
is much like
Oh
you
my
see
God,
the type of
yes.
person who, the type of person, like the fact that they thought celebrity endorsements were going to sway numbers for them suggested that they even thought their own base was really stupid.
Yeah,
Like,
no,
why
I think that's,
why would someone vote because of Beyonce told them to? They must think the voters are really dumb.
yeah. If you think that Beyonce is going to swing them, then you must not think much of them, right? No, I think that's 100% correct, right? And yeah, and I mean, it's a very like easy, silly game to play that like, oh, we found all these. I mean, there's a thing that people love to do on different kinds of shows where they go out into the street and like do a bunch of man on the street interviews with people who support their enemies, who will like say really stupid things. But like, yeah, I mean, it's never hard for people who want to do this in any direction they want to like, it's like, yeah, you do enough interviews, you can find some people, right? Like, and yeah, I mean, I think that it's true, that it's true that people like, it's true that there are lots of people who voted for Trump who are very uninformed about lots of things, but yeah, there are a lot of people who voted for the Democrats who are very uninformed about a lot of things. It's also true that there's a tremendous amount of wishful thinking, right? Like, I'm sure if you go out and you ask and like you ask a bunch of like, as you say, enthusiastic Kamala Harris voters who like, oh, what about Gaza? Right? You'd probably get like tons of like, oh, I'm pretty sure she's gonna like put an end to that, right? Like, or maybe even like, oh, she's saying what she needs to right now. When she's elected, right? She'll put an end to that. Like, yeah, lots of people in lots of directions are good at telling themselves what they want to think. And to take the point a step further, it's not just that lots of enthusiastic Democratic voters are low information. Totally true, right? But and that lots of enthusiastic Democratic voters are prone to all kinds of wishful thinking, etc. Just like lots of enthusiastic Republican voters are. But like, I don't think there's an educational divide in that, really, right? Like, I don't think that having gone to college means that you're like particularly less prone to being irrational about stuff like this. I mean, at least I see very little evidence of that, right? I think that oftentimes the biases are culturally different, but it doesn't really mean, I mean, look, I would like to believe that everybody I've ever taught intro philosophy to goes forth and becomes a rationality machine in the rest of their life, but I don't really think so.
Well, even if they become like a rationality machine, sometimes it's just an ideology machine, and it's kind of
Yeah, right.
a way to rationalize certain like irrational ideas.
Yeah.
So for my undergrad way back,
Yeah.
I basically did like the most technocratic program. It's like the school that people go to become bureaucrats or politicians in Canada. They have a
Okay.
London equivalent of it. And basically, you'd think these are like the experts. And a lot of these people I knew, they would usually be liberal or conservative, or even they would call themselves centrists, policy wonks, these type of people who would say, well, actually, you need homelessness because line go up. They would study economics and they would have a worse understanding of the economy than an average person who was like, well, the landlord seems to be charging me more because he just wants to charge me more because he
Right.
can't.
Right.
You feel like that guy gets it. And they're saying, no, well, it's because like, it's incredible the amount of garbage people learn. It's fantastic. And sometimes this made me more pro-democracy in a certain sense. Like I think
Yeah.
some of the people that come out of places like this, like you're better off randomly selecting a representative, because I don't know if you've heard of Pierre Poilievre in Canada,
Yeah. Yep.
but he's the type of guy who would have went to this program, like the exact type. The other thing that this reminds me of is Mao has a funny quote, which is like why he trusted the peasants because they weren't as brainwashed. He said they were like more blank slates, and he didn't mean to say that they were necessarily stupid, but that they just weren't like brainwashed. And that's why he kind of trusts them. Now, I don't think that's always true, right? But there's something to that. I don't know. It's hard to explain. Like there's something to the fact that being college educated doesn't necessarily make you a more rational voter. It can.
No,
It can.
I think that's,
It doesn't always.
yeah, it definitely doesn't always. I mean, I think that, like, look, I think college is good and like can learn many valuable things, but also, I mean, concretely, I mean, it's really, one of the things that it tends to do is to give people a sense of identification with like educated professionals as a social category. And like people, I think, have a very easy time patting themselves on the back for that when it leads them to like not be socially conservative, which fair enough. It's good to not be socially conservative, but then I think
Why? What does that mean?
sure.
It means different things to different people.
Yeah.
Like,
I
you
mean,
mean it is imposing it on other people, or like personally?
yeah,
Like
exactly.
some people I think are just have that as a belief, but they don't want to impose it on others. And then there's some who want to
Well,
impose
I mean,
it
if
on others.
that's what you mean, right? Like that, like you want to have a very traditional family where, you know, you and your 8 kids go to mass together or whatever, then yes, I have not the slightest objection to that. But I mean, like, wanting to ban abortion, right? That would be
Right.
an example of a socially conservative position, things like that, right? So I think oftentimes when they're rejected stuff like that, people kind of pat themselves on the back about how, oh, see, this worked. I became more rational, right? Because I went to college. And it's like, yeah, but that can also just be that you identify more with educated professionals, credential strivers as a category and the sort of beliefs and attitudes of the tribe. And so in that case, it looks like thinking things through better. But like in other cases, like I think certainly the landlord one you gave, but even like, I think foreign policy, certainly, that I think a belief that people often form as a result of identifying with educated professionals as a social category is that the foreign policy establishment must fundamentally know what it's doing, that there has to be a sort of basic reasonableness to wars that the United States gets involved with around the world. And because it would be really unsophisticated to say that, no, this is just that like foreign adventurism is just self-destructive and ridiculous, right? Or that this just sort of a projection of imperial aggression around the world. It's like, well, I mean, you don't have to be an expert to believe that, right? That you have like that, if anything, surely the people who are presented to you as experts on cable news, et cetera, none of them do believe that, right? So the collective attitudes and beliefs of the tribe would actually make you less likely to think something like that. It's unreasonable. It's simplistic, right? And I think there are a fair number of examples like that where I think that in particular cases, being part of, I don't love the term analytically, but like just for lack of a better way to put it, right? The PMC, right? The professional managerial classes, that like, being part of that, or even if you're not really part of that in terms of your job, at least having that sense of cultural identification with it as a result of your education is, I mean, can definitely lead you to more irrational political behavior. And I would also just say, kind of like circling back to the Trump voters. Okay. I think that, granted, like nobody on either side is a rationality machine, right? That people, tons of people who vote all sorts of ways are low information in different ways, are prone to wishful thinking in different ways, all that stuff, right? All obviously true. But granted that, it's like, no, it's not like people are just making random decisions either, or this is totally disconnected from their perceived interests. And if you want to say it, I think this is fair to say, right? That a lot of what the Trump campaign was in some ways just like really ludicrous pseudo populism. It's like, okay, but like, if you're going to effectively to make that case to people who aren't going to be like looking up specific details on your campaign website to see, oh, exactly what is the difference between the Harris and Trump position on this tax subject, then you do need to have a better narrative, right? I mean, like if it's, oh, this ridiculous pseudo populism, then these people who don't sound like populists at all, if you look into the details, they're 30% better on like concrete policy. It's like, that's not really going to get it done, right? Like you have to give people a clear narrative about how what you're selling is going to be better for their interest, which seems like it should be obvious, but apparently not, because we got 3 months of remember how bad Trump was. The Cheney family loves me.
Democracy. Even though we did nothing to really make democracy better.
Yeah, exactly. And nothing about how democracy is going to actually work for you and improve your life, right? I mean, like presumably the point of democracy is that we vote for politicians who then do things to help us, right? It's not just that we like have.
Yeah, nobody believes that anymore.
Yeah, well, that's the problem, right?
Well, that's good. Good that they don't. That's what's funny. The liberals are always saying Trump's like making people lose faith in democracy. I'm like, no, I think they voted for him because they lost faith in democracy, and that's that's a rational reaction, actually. I think. Like, I think demagoguery is only ever really the result of a failing democracy. Like, I mean, think about why was even Caesar so popular? Because like everyone knew the Roman Republic, the pseudo democracy, was basically rigged in favor of the rich. And Caesar, he says he's going to do land reform. Of course, he's popular. He hates aristocrats at the time. Of course, he's popular.
Yeah, no,
what do people expect.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think people don't. Yeah, I think the disillusionment certainly happened long before Trump. That Trump is a symptom of that. But like once you've got into that point, just kind of like pearl clutching about how norm breaking he is, just isn't going to do anything for anybody who wasn't already like 1,000% in your camp.
It's also not even immediately clear as to whether it was actually not in the interests of Trump voters who are working class to vote Trump. Like, it's actually really, to me, it's not actually that obvious this time around, because and Kamala Harris really did not make it clear as to what her policy even was for the working class. I mean, she flip-flopped all over the place. And even like some of Biden's better policies, she didn't even really do a good job of actually reminding people of. He did not like really the idea that Biden's the most pro-labor president. It's kind of, I don't know. It's like saying,
yeah, it's like when
not saying much in the last 40 years of neoliberalism.
Michael Harrington died, right? William F. Buckley said that he was the most prominent socialist in the United States, which is a bit like being the tallest building in Wichita, Kansas.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and
it's a very low bar.
So like people can say, yeah, Trump is a criminal. He's a degenerate. I mean, he's a guy who like pays prostitutes. He doesn't pay his taxes. He does all kind of things that are very unpresidential. And he might be a rapist. It's very highly plausible he is. Tons of accusations. And he has links to Epstein. He's a filthy individual, right? Sure. In terms of his pure policies, like if people are thinking solely rationally, economically, I mean, he just said he was consistent in his message. His message was low taxes, high tariffs, less immigration. And all those things are kind of linked economically, even if one doesn't believe tariffs will actually bring back jobs, or if they might just cause higher costs. That's like a policy wonk debate. But I think an average person hears that. They hear maybe more jobs and they hear less immigration. And I would definitely say Trump's immigration policy is extremely immoral. It's It's pretty
Yeah.
horrific. I mean,
Sure.
severing people from their families. But the fact of the matter is like from an immediate short-term economic interest perspective, it's not like it's common sense, right? You have less people competing for the same jobs. That's higher prospect for wages, and then more jobs like that. That's actually was historically like trade unions often opposed mass immigration in America for that reason. And I don't think that the left's answer should be to say, oh, we should support mass deportations. Definitely not. But you should look at that's why you need an even more pro working class message in another way, right? Like to have other policies that benefit the working class. Because if not, you can't really go say that people who voted for Trump are just morons
Sure.
and aren't thinking in their interests. I think it's different case because you can say the abortion stuff. For women, it would not be in their interest. But I think a lot of working class men are kind of just thinking in their own interest, and they're going by that. And maybe they're not thinking of the consequences of states outlawing abortion. Because in terms of support, people do seem to still support abortion based on all those votes, right?
Yeah. I mean, looking at the numbers, you also had a lot of people who voted for state ballot measures to protect abortion who also voted for Trump.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that tariffs in some ways, I mean, this is where the pseudo populism with Trump, to my mind, gets the most pseudo and the weirdest historically, right? Because you think about the original populists in the 1880s and 90s, the arch villain of that story is William McKinley, who's the big tariff guy, who Trump actually, if you listen to his Joe Rogan episode, does this weird little, it's like he goes off about how much he loves McKinley in there. And so it's a really weird reversal historically. And I also think if he was, I mean, obviously he's not going to be able to actually do this, but I mean, his stated policy of just completely getting rid of the income tax, replace it with tariffs, I think would be crazily bad for most people, right? Because you end up, you replace the income tax, which at least in you're paying a higher percentage as you go up, with something that in practice is going to be paid by everybody at the grocery store and even in the immigration, which is not to say that look, if you can see that you've got mass job loss due to neoliberal trade policies, it's not a mystery to me why, oh, I love tariffs would be appealing. I mean, I think the sort of specific thing that he's saying, taken literally, would be a disaster. But also, I think on immigration, I think that there's this mistake that people make a lot, where on both sides, where they don't really differentiate between acknowledging what the problem is and endorsing any particular solution to that problem, right? That so people feel the need to, if they want to take pro-immigration positions, people feel the need to deny, right, that low-wage workers coming in, at least to particular fields, can drive down wages in those fields, which is just true, right? I mean, of course it can. But then I think a lot of people say, okay, well, if you acknowledge this, right? So somebody I've spent a lot of time arguing with about various subjects, Sohrab Ahmari from Compact, right? We'll sort of make that case, and they'd be like, see, so therefore Trump border stuff good. And it's well, slow down, right? Because one, I think you can and should have the principled moral objection that you just laid out. But two, it's not even really clear to me that anything that's likely to happen in the next 4 years is going to solve the problem in those terms, because, and I think this is why a lot of unions have shifted their thinking on immigration over the decades, right? I really don't think it's just that they've gone woke or whatever, right? That I think that there is a strategic reason that they've gotten much more friendly to immigration reform over the decades, which is that at this point, there are so many unauthorized immigrants in the United States, so many millions of them, that the idea that you're just going to deport everybody, I think is pretty unrealistic. And yeah, you can of course step up deportations. And in fact, I'm sure Trump is going to have to do that. He spent so much time talking about it in the campaign. I mean, he'll feel the need to make some big show of escalating immigration enforcement. But then if he does, well, like, look, just given the sheer numbers involved, I mean, I'm not at all convinced that you'd have that, you're going to get anything like most of those people in whatever draconian massive crackdown that you end up doing. And the people who you don't get are going to be driven that much further into the shadows, right? Because they're going to be terrified of being deported. So it's going to be that much easier than it even is right now to hyper exploit people because they'll be so afraid of complaining. And so all of which is just to say that I think that the better solution would be to give people
stop the mass migrations from happening. That's a big thing. Like, since which the border doesn't stop, it just makes it harder. Like, it would stop the mass migrations is kind of helping the countries where people are leaving, which is like Venezuela, so stop screwing them, or Haiti, which that's like another country the West has played a role in screwing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly as recently as 2021, right, when Moise is assassinated by people who seem to have a lot of connections in Miami, and then the U.S. seems to be pretty directly meddling in the succession after that. But I mean, even if we're willing to go all the way back to the first Obama term, one of the things that came out in the WikiLeaks cables was that Hillary Clinton's State Department had actually lobbied the Haitian government against raising the minimum wage to the equivalent of $5 a day under pressure from American companies with subsidiaries and Haitian sweatshops. So yeah, I think that absolutely has to be part of the answer, right? That people don't just decide that they hate the societies that they live in just on some kind of cultural level or whatever, right? There are these obvious economic reasons that people do this stuff. And there's a lot that U.S. policy does to exacerbate that problem. And also, I think that you do need to give people a way to become citizens who are already here so they can come out of the shadows and do things like join unions, take their employers to court when they violate labor laws, all that stuff that people are too afraid to do now, right? But the problem, going back to the election, is that Democrats certainly aren't putting forward anything like that kind of alternative vision. What they were putting forward was this very unconvincing, watered down version of what Trump was saying. And it's like, well, look, if you bought the premise, like, who are you going to believe? The guy who hasn't shut up about it for the last decade, or the people who just started saying this stuff like 18 months ago when they saw some bad polls?
Yeah, in 2016, they were calling the whole border wall thing fascist. And in 2020, they were critiquing Trump on the whole idea that they proposed a bill in Congress that was basically what Trump wanted, and that the Republicans rejected it so that they would have something to campaign on. And it's like, who are you trying to win over here? Like,
totally, I mean, we went all the way from like, this was the main reason you were supposed to think Trump was a fascist back in like 2018. I vividly remember that, to, oh, they're so irresponsible that they won't work together with us to do the thing they said. Yeah, no, it makes no sense on its own terms. It's insane. And it's incoherent, right? And it's like incoherent on a level that I think, yeah, look, if you basically like Harris and like you like the Democrats, you're willing to get yourself to ignore it, right? But as you say, who are they trying to appeal to? Because if it's people who are already voting for Trump, that's like, well, you're not going to win a who's more anti-immigrant contest with Donald Trump. Right? I mean, that's clearly not going to happen, right? He's just so much more plausible on this issue than you guys are. Cause like, I mean, it is true, right? There was that thing about Harris when she was running for president the first time. There's like the ACLU questionnaire where there's a question about, do you want to pay for like gender transition care for trans undocumented immigrants in detention centers? And she said yes. Right. And it's like, yeah, look, because she was trying to pander in the opposite way 4 years ago. And so she was just like raising her hand to whatever she thought that people wanted to hear. And
that came against her a lot. I saw in the Trump attack ads. they were using that clip over and over. Like that one clip where she said you'd pay for undocumented. It was so absurd. It was like undocumented transgender immigrants. It was like they just like combined all of their boogeymen into
Yeah,
one
exactly.
person.
It's like,
And and
It's
it's like somebody here. I can see why somebody hearing that it would be pissed off though. Who's like a low information voter because they hear that and they're like, you don't even want. I don't even have health care. Like if I do have health care, I'm paying
for like,
for it. Like,
yeah,
what?
you're paying for this like highly unusual healthcare for undocumented. No, totally right. That's the like. I mean, it's like, and the whole issue is so absurd all around. It's like why couldn't you just like back then? Why couldn't you just answer that question? Wait, are you asking me about something that applies to like 3 people? Like, why is this what we're talking about right now? Right? Like, but yeah, right. So it's like, look, you can't say that and then turn around and be like, oh, actually, I'm the whatever little formula she always repeated. I was the tough prosecutor who was the only person here who prosecuted international cartels and border traffickers or whatever. It's like, yeah, okay, you were, but more recently than that, you were posturing on the other side of this issue. So like, just because you flipped around now, very recently, right, doesn't mean that anybody's going to take it seriously. Or frankly, they really should take it seriously, right? Because it's not like, yeah, look, I think it is a bit of a sign of being low information to say, oh, Kamala's, and she's like a super lefty because in 2019 she was pandering in that direction. But like, it's not wrong to at least get the impression that she probably doesn't mean whatever she's saying now, because she was saying something completely different a few years ago, right? I mean, that part is actually not at all irrational.
No, I agree. I mean, like her dishonesty, that is just a fact, right? I think it's more like those crazy like fears, the moral panics are pretty irrational a lot of the time.
Sure.
Like people worrying about issues that probably will not affect them. like the whole trans stuff. Though I am curious actually kind of
Sure.
what do you think about some of the rhetoric around that stuff? Because what I noticed is this was largely a kind of moral panic drummed up by the right that originally only right-wingers ever cared about. But I noticed a sudden shift in the past 2 years where people who I know who aren't even that political kind of now being a little scared about like, oh, or my kids, blah, blah, blah. And I noticed the big shift is when the trans debate started involving children. I noticed people started going berserk because I noticed kids, anything involving kids, the Save the Children cry, that was so powerful
Sure.
for the right.
I think that the problem with this issue is that it is like, there are very simple aspects of it, but there are also really complicated and messy aspects. So the simple stuff, like the stuff that to my mind is a no-brainer, is like, yeah, man, you adults have a right to do what they want with their bodies, right? That's straightforward. And you should like call people what they want to be called, right? I mean, I think that's just sort of generally not being an asshole. But then you do have these legitimately much more complicated issues that come up around it, right? And that I think would be sort of universally seen as a little complicated if they hadn't become culture war issues in the way that they have, right? Just because, like, look, human beings in every society we've ever had so far have done a lot of sorting of themselves by gender, right? And there are an awful lot of things that we do that we have some kind of classification or sorting between men and women about. And then when you start to have it be more accepted that some people's sense of themselves doesn't align with how we would otherwise normally categorize them, look, there are going to be messy edge cases where different groups of people have different legitimate interests that are in conflict. That's just true, right? So I think that obvious, for example, right? I think that the athletics, like, to me, it's crazy that that's become a culture war issue in the way that it has, because I would just think, look, this is like something you would spend 2 weeks arguing about in a bioethics class. And you come out of it at the end being like, man, this is actually a way harder issue than I thought it was. I think that denying that, like, some leftists end up, I think, becoming like, because you're right, a lot of this originates in right-wing moral panic. That's true, right? But I think the problem is that then a lot of people react to the right-wing moral panic by negatively polarizing themselves into thinking things that aren't really defensible, right? Like, oh, there's actually zero reason to think that having gone through male puberty gives you an average advantage in sports as well. That's not plausible, right? I mean, come on. And I will, anything like that, I'd say, I know people are gonna be like, oh, that's a straw man. It's like, no, spend some time on Twitter. It's not a straw man. There are lots of people who'll say things like that, right? And one thing I think that people, because it's become a culture war issue, a lot of people have absorbed some like simple narratives that point in the directions that they morally like, that just don't really stand up that well to scrutiny. So, because people think, well, it's really, really hard to get puberty blockers, and so anybody who ends up getting them must be especially determined, and so there's just sort of no doubt whatsoever that this is a permanent position. And anybody who thinks there should be that, like, who wants more medical gatekeeping must just be a bigot, right? So, like, again, I think you have these what are actually pretty complicated medical ethics issues that people want to take a really simple stand on and sort of give that stand the moral valence of, like, desegregating drinking fountains. And it's just not plausible, right? That it's like, no, I'm sorry. That with something like, it's not actually that there are, like, people will be like, oh, well, the entire medical community agrees on this. It's like, well, only if you pretend that the rest of the world doesn't exist, right? I mean, there are lots of countries that are not particularly right-wing religious places where the prevailing medical establishment view is actually much more cautious than the prevailing view in the US. And if anything, I mean, I'd be slightly less trusting of the US, of US medical associations than European ones, just because the profit motive is such a bigger part of our healthcare system than most countries in the world, right? I mean, like that seems pretty straightforward, right? So none of this is to say that I would support like a ban or anything like that. I actually don't, right? Not at all. I think that it's hard. I think that there's obvious reason that when you're talking about minors who nobody seriously believes should have full medical autonomy, or almost nobody does, nobody sane does, that there are obvious reasons to want there to be lots of medical gatekeeping. I know people say, oh, there's already so much, there's already too much. It's like, the United States is a big place. It really depends where you are. Right. I think that's the truth, right? That you can have that, how much there is. I think there's going to be a lot of local variation. And again, there are other countries in the world that have a much more cautious approach to this, that are generally places where prevailing cultural attitudes, they're pretty secular, pretty progressive places in other ways. And again, none of this is to say, oh, therefore I want the left to like take the conservative position on any of this stuff. Not at all, right? Like I think like exactly how the rules should work for sports participation is a tricky issue, but it does strike me as worryingly cruel to just tell some people that, oh, you're not allowed to play school sports, right? We can't find any way for you to do that. I don't like that. Right. I think that I think that there are reasons to worry about bad incentives with the for-profit healthcare industry in the US, as far as ease of assigning puberty blockers and all of that. I think Slavoj Žižek had an article about this like a year ago, 2 years ago.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of what he said in that is reasonable concerns, right? But like, here's the larger thing.
I think he did it at the wrong time. That's why. Like, he was a reasonable concern, but he did it at like the time where everyone was like attacking the trans stuff. Like Ron DeSantis was doing
Right.
his whole thing. So like, I think people saw it as him contributing to the fire.
Yeah, right. No, I get that, right? Like, I think that they like, and I don't even have like, oh, here's like some particular policy conclusion. Like, here's exactly what I think policy should be on all this. All I'm trying to express is that I'm uncomfortable with the way that a lot of leftists have decided that, like, just from ideological first principles, we therefore have to embrace the sort of maximalist left-coded position on this. I think that's a mistake, right? I think that again, very easy issues. Like, adults can do whatever they want with their bodies. You should respect people's identity, call them what they want to be called, right? That stuff, very easy. I think like exactly what the rules should be about sports or puberty blockers. I think those are much harder, much messier issues. I'm very far from being an expert on any of it, and I don't have like a particularly firm position, but I really dislike taking what again do strike me as hard, essentially biomedical ethics issues, and just saying, well, we've set up this like super clear friend enemy distinction, and this is all as like morally simple as desegregation, as letting women vote, right? Whatever, like some historical case like that. It's like same-sex marriage, right? Like, I think it's like, no, I think it is more complicated. It's a little unclear in some of these cases exactly what the right position is. And I think that so this is what I was saying earlier about social conservatism. I mean, like, not in the sense of like, oh, just being kind of personally, culturally traditional or whatever, but like in the sense of wanting to ban abortion, wanting to ban gender affirming care, whatever, right? Like, yes, I think that stuff is bad. I think that there are some certain kind of the same kind of really basic egalitarian values that lead me to be a socialist, lead me to think that that stuff is bad. You really don't have to just say, oh, therefore, whatever position seems furthest from the people that I don't like on this stuff must be correct. Because one, I mean, coalitionally, like making every single, no matter how complicated and messy it is, making every single social issue that comes up like a loyalty test, right? You know, that like whether you're like a good person who's allowed inside the tent or not, I think is just kind of a long-term disaster, right? And so that's like the pragmatic objection. And then I also think that like just in principle, in terms of trying to figure out what the right thing is, this is a really bad mechanism for figuring out what the right thing is. I mean, I don't like, I think like conservative Republicans are the last people in the world I would trust to get any of this stuff right. But I think if we're just trying to figure out what the right answer is, I mean, I think it's okay. It's okay to just let things be messy, right? Like, it's okay to say some issues are complicated and I'm not 100% sure what the right answer is on them. And I think there's this really dangerous thing that happens on the left where people sort of perceive any kind of talk like that as just like centrist, right? That's like, oh, that's wishy-washy. That's like what a centrist would say. And it's like, some things aren't complicated, right? There are absolutely things that are very basic questions of principle that like annoying centrists will say are complicated, right? That's true. Should we be shipping 2,000-pound bombs to Israel, drop on refugee camps? No, that's very not complicated, right? Is it okay that is it okay to treat healthcare as a commodity? No, right? Very not complicated. But like, look, some stuff is complicated. And I think that it's both kind of indefensible on the merits and politically self-defeating to just insist that it's like, no, whatever the opposite is of what our ideological enemies say must be true on absolutely everything all the way down the line.
Exactly. I mean, people think that they forget what the critique of centrism was supposed to be. Like the critique of centrism is that it's not even real. It's not that like actually taking from both sides of the argument, that you should listen to both sides of the argument. But the problem with centrists is that they presume like that the answer is in the center before actually looking at both sides of the argument and weighing what is the better side, right? Like that's the argument of it. It's not that like you shouldn't be dialectical and look at the contradictions of both sides of the argument. Because like, yeah, as you're kind of pointing to, there is this tendency to take whatever the opposite position of what the right is as the left position is, the reaction. And I do see the right-left binary as serving this role in a lot of ways, in that like they're kind of defined in opposition to each other. Like the right defines itself by we're opposing this hard left radical social stuff or whatever they perceive the left is. And the left sometimes perceives itself, even though I think it should be positioned as a kind of vision, like a vision of a different society. In practice, a lot of it's just like opposing the right for a lot of people, and they kind of define themselves in that way. And I see this with all kind of issues, not just this one. I noticed when there was a lot of discourse regarding evolutionary psychology, because Jordan Peterson likes to all sort of evolutionary psychology, pseudoscientific arguments to justify political ideas, like was Lobster's theory of equality or whatever. Like they kind of invoke all these arguments. And then I saw this one video. It was called Debunking the Entire Evolutionary Psychology. And the person's video, I thought they were just going to debunk like silly arguments, but they kind of attempted to debunk evolutionary psychology as a discipline.
Yeah.
Like they just rejected the whole thing as a discipline. And I'm like, whoa. Because they're saying, they end up just saying, no, this is actually mostly socially constructed. Actually, it's mostly socially constructed. This is, you can't find the answer to this. It's a pseudo discipline. It's inherently right wing. And it reminded me a lot of like the arguments you hear sometimes of lefties saying like economics is all bullshit. And it's like, yeah, there's a lot of bullshit, but you're going to just like reject economics like as a thing entirely. Like just you're going to act like it's all just a political question. Like that's not what Marx did.
Yeah, no, definitely not.
Not a scientific approach.
Yeah. I mean, look, Marx spent God knows how many thousands of hours at the reading room at the British Museum, like reading books of political economy, and sometimes agreeing with what Ricardo or whoever said. There's plenty of that in Capital, and when disagreeing, feeling the need to make like really detailed arguments for why it's wrong, right? And certainly, I mean, it is actually really striking, right? Especially people think of themselves as Marxists, like how differently they approach this, because Marx never says like, oh, well, Smith or Ricardo or Senior or whoever McCullough, they all say blah, 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 but whatever. That's just their ideological blindness and moves on, right? Like that's like he never actually dismisses anything these people say, right? Like every time he disagrees with them, he'll spend like 10 pages giving you this intricate argument about why he thinks they're wrong, right? Like he never thinks that it just kind of goes without saying. It's like, well, I mean, he never just does, well, economics isn't a real science anyway, so we can just disregard all of this stuff, right? Like, and it's actually unimaginable to think about Marx writing that sentence. He would not have written that sentence. And yeah, I think that I did just want to touch back on the point about centrism, because like, I think you're right. Like a lot of what we call the left is just a matter of this kind of like reacting to the other team, right? I mean, this is why my friend David Griscom always jokes. It's like people talk about like the left position on this, that, or the other thing. It's like, was there a vote? Did I miss it? Right? We all decided that this is what we thought, right? Like, how do I keep missing those meetings, right? And it's like, yeah, if that's like, I think if you just kind of navigate politics by taking whoever annoys you the most and like working backwards from the need for them to always be wrong about everything, right? Whether it's that what's most important to you is conservatives be wrong, so you end up kind of taking like maximalist left-coded positions on every social issue, or whether it's you really hate the libs more than anything. So you end up backing yourself up into some bizarre, like, I don't know, Jimmy Dore, like MAGA communist kind of place. Cause that's where the libs get to be most wrong about everything. It's like, yeah, you're going to end up in some very strange places. Like you gotta
Red Scare.
yeah, right. Red Scare.
The embodiment. Yeah.
Absolutely. I actually, I actually have a story about them, but
We'll save that for the back room because that's where we do the shit talking.
yeah, fair enough. But like, it's, you got to do it the other way around, right? You got to start with like, look, what's my analysis of how the world works? What are the values that I care about? And you work forward from there, right? So I think that I think that there's some like basic egalitarian values that I care about that like certainly are more than enough to condemn capitalism, but also I think do entail a certain kind of baseline social liberalism, let people do what they want with their own lives. And there's a analysis of how the world works that makes me think that like class-based politics is the best mechanism for advancing this, right? But like that's just a completely different way of approaching this than what, even if they would never admit it, right? So many people do in practice, which is just I really, really need the bad people to be wrong.
Right. Yeah. Because you come at it from a logical perspective, and a lot of these people come at it from a maximalist, contrarian position, which is like, it's one thing to say, let's decriminalize or even legalize prostitution because banning prostitution just makes it unsafe because people use it anyway. People do it anyway. And all that does is makes it more unsafe for the sex workers who are more easily victimized when it's illegal. And then it's another thing to say, oh, sex work should be legal because girl boss, it's fine and make your money. And there's nothing wrong with commodifying people's bodies.
Right.
But,
Which is also like I really, really hate that phrase sex work, because it seems like the whole point of that expression is to blur the line between things that are just obviously not at all the same thing, right? That's like, somebody who like makes a lot of money off OnlyFans versus like somebody who's actually a street level prostitute and circumstances that might not be that different from actual slavery and certainly involve a lot of danger and degradation. Like it's to like being a stripper or whatever. It's like, yeah, it's like, I think it's one of those terms that mostly functions to help people not have to think through uncomfortable distinctions.
Yeah, declasses like the class dynamics behind that social issue, right?
Yeah, totally, right? Because it's like, yeah, you're doing
more evidence for profit making.
Yeah, you're doing something that's commodified, has something to do with sex, right? That's all that like sex work means, and it's like, well, okay, but these things are just very obviously not the same. And I think people end up coming to this sort of down in this weirdly libertarian place about it, right? That's because like, it's one thing to make the kind of harm reduction argument that you just did, right? Like, and it's very different to say, well, we should just like let people do whatever they want, especially especially when like the thing that people want to do is something that they're willing to agree to do out of extreme economic desperation, right? Like, careful.
If you couldn't get rich off this, I don't think anyone would voluntarily do it. Like, people do it because either they can't make money at all, and if they aren't poor, they do it because they can get rich, aka OnlyFans. And if you had a socialist society, I don't think, I don't think this thing that would be like that common. I don't think.
Yeah, and like you definitely don't want to say it's like, well, look, somebody, given the option presented to them in dire economic circumstances, like there are people who are willing to sign up to do X. Therefore, if you don't want to be paternalistic, you just have to like let people do X, because now you've just made an argument against the minimum wage, right? I mean, it's that like people are willing to accept employment contracts for less than that, right? It's or whatever, child labor, working 16 hours a day, right? These are all things that people are willing to do with the right economic circumstances. So I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that like a lot of, again, none of this is to say that it's like, oh, the right solution is just completely ban prostitution, because I think there are like serious harm-based arguments against doing that, right? But like, it is to say that I think a lot of leftists, certainly at least a lot of online leftists, end up sort of talking themselves into this weirdly libertarian position on this that's not even really consistent with the rest of what they think.
I call it the anarchism to ANCAP pipeline. They kind of adopt this like moral relativist or moral nihilist position, which is either like you have your own morals and so do they, so it doesn't really matter. It's all about power, yada yada. And then like you can just do, I mean, like Foucault himself is a kind of embodiment of this. Like, I mean, Foucault, I think it's a guy who lived his philosophy. If you look at all his pedophile allegations, like he's a guy who thought it was all power, the morals are a spook, and he would go drive his Jaguar and fuck little kids. I mean, allegedly.
Sure.
Allegedly. But he just really liked to go to North Africa, not for sex tourism. But in the back room, I was gonna ask you about the topic of cancel culture.
Sure.
And you wrote a whole book about this, and I think like who needs to write a book about cancel culture? But I mean, you have some interesting things to say, and I did want to save this for the back room just because I know some names will get brought up, and I don't know if you want them to get brought up. I know you know a lot of people in this industry, but I have a very.
But yeah, let's go. Let's do that.
The people. My backroom audience is very intelligent. Like I'll say that. Like I've been trying to facilitate an audience who's like open-minded and can think for themselves and aren't like this deranged Twitter type lefties. So yeah, no, if you're not part of the backroom already, you like this show, you should become one. It's less than a latte at Starbucks, and that's just for a whole month, and you get like 45 exclusive episodes. What are you doing? Just become a patron. And if you don't know Ben already, you should check out his work. Check out his writings on Jacobin and his books and his show, which I'd like to do something on your show at some point.
Yeah,
and I know Victor was telling me about that. Victor, who I had on the Pill Pod.
Yeah.
I think want to organize something. But yeah, I'll see you in the back room.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.